Welcome back to this year's Misinformation Speaker Series. My name is Bryony Thompson from Northeastern University, and I'm co-hosting this year alongside Matt Baum and David Lazar. I'd like to introduce two speakers today for this very special event. We have online Sander van der Linden, who is a professor of social psychology and society at the University of Cambridge, and he is the director of the Cambridge Social Decision-Making Lab. Here in person, we have Gordon Pennycook, who's a Himan Brown Faculty Fellow and Associate Professor of Psychology at Cornell University. He's also an adjunct professor at University of Regina's Hill Levene School of Business. So today is a very special session because two of our speakers, by chance, decided to present on two very similar topics. So, for reference, neither us nor the speakers themselves knew what the event would be today. The format of today's session is that each speaker has 25 minutes to present. They'll then be able to respond to each other's presentations and discuss for a maximum of... It's okay. No. They'll be able to discuss for a maximum of 15 minutes, followed by question time. So for those online, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A, and we can read them out on your behalf. So with that, over to you, Sander.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I really look forward to this. It's great to be able to get together and have a good scientific discussion this way about a topic. I hope this format turns out to be a win, so perhaps it can occur more often. So I'm gonna jump right in here just to be on time. I don't think I have to explain to this audience what some of the consequences of misinformation are. In the UK, people were setting phone masts on fire during the pandemic. In Iran, people ended up in the hospital because they read on social media that methanol cures the virus. I mean, this included children. Here we have the change or RNA trope. And I think what's actually important here is I'm not so interested in the claims that are made here, but in the sort of repeated tropes that occur throughout history. So a lot of people thought that this mRNA argument was new, right? It's a new vaccine, and so it's going to change your DNA because of this new technology. But it turns out, if you trace this back to Edward Jenner, who came up with the first modern vaccine, right? That it was a cowpox vaccine against smallpox. You can find images online of people made during this time where there were, cow udders sprouting out of people's eyes and ears. And the whole story was that if you took the vaccine, you were going to turn into a human-cow hybrid. I mean, that was really the propaganda narrative. Don't take the vaccine because you're going to turn into a human cow. So 200 years later, we have the exact same trope, just in a new jacket. And I think our interest is in targeting these repeated tropes rather than, specific claims. And I don't have the image in here, but it is on the internet. If you Google cowpox vaccine hesitancy, it will come up. This is the disappearing needle video. Is popular in the UK. This is a train heading to Ukraine. This was during the conflict, went viral on Facebook. Turns out this is Southern California for people who know. So it's a shallow fake. Of course, we have Putin and his propaganda about Nazis. Don't have to tell you guys about the Capitol riots. People argue, was it misinformation? Turns out, though, PolitiFact looked at this, at all of the legal case files, and determined that in over half of cases, people made reference to their motivations being specifically based on the conspiracy that the election was stolen. Israel, Hamas, tons of visual disinformation happening here. So it goes on and on. We recently, and in fact, I should say, Bryony was a key part of this. We put out a consensus statement on the what we know about misinformation through the APA. We had lots of debates about what is misinformation, because people like to ask that question. And I think we all agreed that we wanted to do something that's inclusive, and that there's so many definitions, and all of them have their strengths and weaknesses, including the term fake news itself, which we know, of course, is highly politicized. But we want it to be as broad and inclusive as possible. So our consensus definition of the whole committee, therefore, was that we're going to focus on evidence of manipulation rather than the source of an article, its intent, or whether it's been fact-checked or not. So our definition of misinformation here, and in the broadest possible sense, is any information that is either false or otherwise misleading, regardless of source or intention. So this can be done with fact-checking, scientific consensus, or known characteristics of deceptive or epistemologically dubious content, whether it's out of context or opinions presented as facts or logical fallacies. So we're being very broad here to try to capture as much of misinformation as we can. It is useful to sort of look at how the field measures this. Some people use lists of fake news URLs, so things that are fact-checked from Snopes or PolitiFact. I think that's totally fine if you want to capture, the slice of misinformation that is fact-checked. But of course, we know that a huge amount of misinformation isn't fact-checked. In fact, the process by which things get selected for fact-checking is quite specific. Other people use sources. Whether the source is dodgy, there are lists. Places like NewsGuard, they rate sources from reliable to unreliable. That's a proxy you can use, right? That overall, let's say the BBC produces less misinformation than InfoWars, so we know on average some sources are better than others. But of course, was that a sarcastic laugh? Someone's like, yeah, right, the BBC. The idea here is that mainstream sources, and in my book I talk a lot about this actually, that mainstream sources can also publish misinformation, which can be much more influential than fringe outlets. And I'll come back to that in a second. It does happen, not all the time, but it does happen. Or you can focus on the absence of misinformation techniques. And so we're not focused on the sort of true-false binary, but we want to help calibrate people's judgments as a function of manipulation more generally, regardless of source or intent. And so that's kind of the background. So here's an example, health impact news. This is fake news. Vitamin C doesn't protect against coronavirus. That's been fact-checked as false, and Health Impact News is also a fake news website. So that one's straightforward. But let me now turn to this one, Chicago Tribune. Healthy doctor died 2 weeks after getting COVID vaccine. CDC is investigating why. So this was, the Chicago Tribune is a reputable outlet, okay? So based on the source, you can't say this is fake news. According to the headline, technically, a healthy doctor did die 2 weeks after getting the vaccine, right? So technically, this has not been fact-checked as false. However, there's a clear manipulation technique that's being used here, which is to imply causation where there's only correlation, right? So the framing is used that because the doctor died because of the vaccine, and that's the conclusion that people reach. And if you want evidence of that, this was the most shared story amongst anti-vaccination groups in the first quarter of 2021 on Facebook. It was the most shared story period on Facebook, and some fantastic research, that's new research from Jennifer Allen and Dave Rand, who's here, actually shows that it's this type of headline that is much more impactful on people's vaccination attitudes. And so then the sort of outright fake news. And that's why I think it's partly because it's so important. And so it matters less to me what's fake news or not. It's who's using these techniques and where do they occur. And so that's kind of our focus. So fact checking is all good and well, right? There's lots of meta-analyses on it, right? Some say it works, some say it works partially. We know that people continue to rely on falsehoods even after it's been corrected. But on overall, there's evidence that fact checking at least works partially. Although a recent meta-analysis claimed that on average there was a zero effect of debunking. I think there's a lot of heterogeneity there, right? So I think it depends on how well you do it. And I think that's true for a lot of interventions in this space, that you can do it in a bad way or you can do it in a high quality way, and that's going to determine some of the effects. But because of all the challenges with trying to debunk stuff after people have already been exposed, that's why we sort of focus on this idea of pre-bunking through inoculation. I know that pre-bunking is now a word that can mean lots of things that come pre, so I'm going to focus specifically on the inoculation analogy. And this very quickly, for people who don't know this, McGuire was one of the first people to come up with this in the 60s, and it follows the vaccination analogy almost exactly. Right. So just as people are exposed to a weakened strain of a virus or an inactivated strain to try to trigger the production of antibodies to help confer resistance against future infection, it turns out you can do the same with the human mind. Right. So you pre-expose people to a weakened dose of a falsehoods or the techniques used to produce falsehoods. You warn people in advance, and over time they can build up cognitive or mental antibodies and become more resistant to misinformation or manipulation in the future, right? And just as your body need lots of examples, lots of microdoses of what an invading pathogen looks like. It's kind of the same with the brain. You need lots of microdoses of manipulation in order to build resistance against it. And that's kind of the idea behind inoculation. There's kind of a dual process theory that people disagree about, whether what's the effective component. Is it the warning and making people feel threatened, or sometimes actually just giving people a weakened dose can be threatening in itself. And so we kind of argue over how much of a dual process this is. But we started doing lab experiments around climate change and other topics, and kind of finding that, yeah, you can debunk false content. And then we started getting these headlines. Cambridge scientists consider fake news vaccine. It's possible to vaccinate Americans, so British people love it when I point out this headline. But in the States, people tend to wonder why Americans. But it's the idea here was that you can do this in the lab, but we got a lot of questions. Now, how can you do this in the real world? How people are not going to come to the lab and read a pre-bunk, right? That's not possible. So we started gamifying this approach, and John Rosenbeek, who some of you know, was definitely spearheading this idea of trying to turn this into a game, and the game was called Bad News. And I want to take people through this intervention a little bit, because a lot of our papers are based on it, just to show you how it works. So Bad News is a game. It's a simulated social media engine. So one of the things that we wanted to do was innovate how people do research in this space, right? Instead of a Qualtrics environment, we wanted people to simulate social media and let people make decisions in a simulated social media environment so that it feels more ecologically valid. And the idea here is that you step into the shoes of a propagandist, and your goal is to gain as many followers as possible without losing any credibility, and make use of weakened doses of some of the general techniques that are used to dupe people online. So you can inoculate people against specific claims using specific weakened doses, and you can do that very controlled. But we wanted to scale this because people would ask, okay, but you inoculate against this conspiracy or that factor that is dubious. But what about the next conspiracy or the next thing? And so following the viral analogy, right, the idea is that if you get a broad spectrum inoculation, then you should be relatively more immune to variants of the same strain, right? So if you know the building blocks of a conspiracy, if I now bombard you with various conspiracies, you should have some transference in terms of immunity, right? So it's a depth breadth consideration. You can inoculate very well specifically, but then you lose breadth. You can try to scale it broadly, and then you get smaller effect sizes because you're not going to catch all of the examples, but you're going to have some broader immunity. So here you're stepping into the shoes of Donald Trump. After long deliberation with my generals, have decided to declare war on North Korea. # Kim Jong-un. So you tweet this, and you get people to respond to you. For political balance, we also have Joe Biden in there. As your president, I've issued an executive order to rename Canada North Dakota. # you got annexed. That one was for you, Gordon. And so, the idea here is that you're making use of impersonation, right? So the Twitter handle is manipulated here. So a lot of people don't notice that on the pre-test, but then on the post-test, once they go through weakened doses and exposures of how this technique works, they become relatively more resistant, right? Mainstream media is massive conspiracy. We all know that. Impersonating NASA. So people respond to you, right? It's an interactive 20-minute simulation. People are cheering you on, and the narrator is telling you how to be more sinister in using some of these techniques. And here are the techniques we came up with. This list is not exhaustive, right? But talking to governments, we interviewed people who work in Russian troll farms, right? We looked at the intelligence literature. So we came up with 6 techniques that are pretty broadly deployed, polarizing people with us versus them headlines, impersonating fake doctors, right? Experts during the pandemic, politicians during debates, creating your own conspiracy, trolling people using emotions. Not every emotion, right? The idea here is the appeal to emotion fallacy, right? So distract people away from the evidence by using fear mongering, for example, and discrediting people selectively using particular tactics like sowing doubt, denial, and so on. And you get your badge. It's all fictional, right? So it had to be weakened doses. The ethics committee at the time certainly wouldn't have let us do this game if this was real. But it's based on reality, okay? So somebody impersonated Warren Buffett using the same trick as I showed you with Trump by manipulating the Twitter handle, got hundreds of thousands of followers within minutes, and was tweeting out all kinds of nonsense like, oh, invest in what makes you happy. So the examples are ecologically valid, but they're all fictional. And so we test people with these headlines. Again, I'm not interested, is this true, false? I'm interested in how reliable people find this now that they know that some of these techniques are being deployed, right? And so the idea is that people don't come out of this game thinking something is true or not true, right? That's not the purpose. People come out of this game thinking something is slightly less reliable now that they've been empowered to spot some of these tactics. So this was total fake news. We made this up. This is trolling. Hey, Leo, it's always snowing in New York. Could use some of that global warming you're always going on about, right? This isn't true fake, but this is Johnson crude oil making use of trolling. So John Rosenbeek, here he is, especially famous for his hair, other than his amazing papers. So we did this organically, right? It happened to go viral online. So we got lots of people to opt into this research, which was handy. So in the first few weeks, we had about 30,000 pre-post responses, very simple pre-post design. I mean, this was a field study run amok, right? And so it was pretty random. And here are the headlines that we used for the real news, which were just factual, neutral statements. People didn't change on that, but they found the fake news that made use of these tactics, or I should say misinformation, less reliable following gameplay. Here are the plots. So it didn't really matter if you were left, right, young, old, lower, higher educated. I mean, it matters for your baseline susceptibility, but not so much for the intervention effect. Of course, people had lots of valid critiques, right? Oh, maybe you just picked the items that were easy for people to spot. Oh, it doesn't have a control group. It's not a placebo-controlled trial. All good points. The problem with the game is that it slows down the engine the more that you try to do. You also take people out of the experience, right? And so we created a plugin so it's easier to do research with this game. We did a randomized experiment. Adding a control group. We added more items to have better psychometric validity, so 3 for each technique, so that's 18 items. And then we did it again with the control group who played Tetris for 20 minutes. Got lots of comments asking whether that's what Cambridge is doing now, paying people to play Tetris for 20 minutes. But yes, if you're in the control group, not the cheapest experiments, I should say. So here you see nothing going on in the control group. Density is around 0, and people find this is the average of all the fake news headlines. People find it significantly less reliable. Here's the effect size. Here are the density distributions. Melissa, my student, was fascinated in confidence. She said, people are going to be easily persuaded if you're not very confident in your own abilities, right? That's what manipulators exploit. And so we also found that the game boosted people's confidence in their reliability judgments. Now, I'm going to show you one more experiment on this, and I'm going to move on. People ask, okay, great, so you can inoculate people, but what about the long-term effectiveness of this approach, right? If it decays in 5 minutes, then how practically useful is it? So the setup of these experiments are always very similar. So I'm going to run you through once. So we have our pre-test of the 18 items, then we randomize people to inoculation versus control, and then we started testing them again, week after week after week after week, for a period of up to 2 months. In the second experiment, we cut out all of the intermediate testing and just followed up with people at the end. And at the third experiment, we changed the items throughout the testing period. Some reviewer was like, what are people just remembering their answers because you're always giving the same items? It's like, I don't even know what I had for dinner last night, but let's assume people are remembering their answers to 18 items over months. So we switched out the items. And so what you see here, by the way, everything's on the open science framework, pre-registered and open access, open data if people want to play around. So what you see here is nothing. And then here you have the intervention effect. But it kept going this way week after week for a period of 2 months. So I told Raccoon, the student who was leading this, that, I mean, this is impossible, right? Even with the COVID vaccine, it wears off over time. So we need to investigate this further because this would be too good to be true. And so in the second experiment, that's exactly what you see, actually. So there's still the intervention effect at the last testing period between the two groups, but now people find fake news more reliable, again, over time. And so there's a more than 50% decay of the effect. And it turned out, and we later tested this in many experiments, that what's happening is that there are two processes, two mechanisms that are responsible for the inoculation effect here. One is motivation to want to defend yourself, but the other is your memory of the actual material. And in lots of experiments, we tried to test a comprehensive model of this. And this paper is in revision for Nature Comms at the moment, where we have 3 different models. So we looked at all the inoculations that we did, the lab experiments, the games, the videos I'll show you next. And then we tried to come up with mechanisms that could explain why the effect decreases across all different ways of inoculating. And what stood out for us is that, I'm not going to go into this, it's kind of a complicated model, but basically what what you find, this is the dominance analysis of all of the possible explanations. Memory is really a leading factor in terms of people forgetting the stuff, and motivation comes in second. But there is an important relationship that, of course, if you're not motivated, you're not going to remember stuff. So motivation does predict memory pretty heavily, but the effect is more indirect on memory of the actual inoculation material. So that's pretty interesting. So then, we got some help from the government in trying to scale this in the UK. And so we started doing this on a wider scale. So they helped translate bad news in every major language so we could do large cross-cultural studies. We did one in Sweden. This is a school experiment working with, for example, educational psychologists. So they translate the game, they use their own items, but they were interested in different hypotheses about how people learn. So individuals playing the game or in pairs or with the whole class, and actually did matter. So again, this is the kind of average effect you find on the manipulative items in Swedish. These were different items than we use. And they also boosted people's recognition of real news in Swedish significantly. And so it also helped them discern better between the two. And they also did some interesting qualitative testing by asking people what strategies they use. And you see this interesting decline in the focus on the content and more focus on the strategies that people end up paying attention to. And that's kind of what we want. We're not changing people's source heuristic, which is also kind of nice because, we're not telling people anything about sources, so they're still paying attention to sources. So that's kind of good. People looked at this in India. I don't know, these researchers, they did this independently in India, kind of replicating our effects. Here, they also find that people trusted real news more after playing the game and fake news less. Our game isn't really set up to help people spot good sources and the sort of indicators of real news, but so it's interesting that there's this kind of variation in these effects. In fact, there was a meta-analysis recently of the whole inoculation literature, and they sub-sampled our studies, finding overall significant discernment across all of our different studies. But some people have noted to us that sometimes you can get a bit of skepticism on real news items. And there's a long kind of debate about this. We're not so concerned about this for a variety of reasons, but we recognize that other people might find it undesirable that sometimes with real news items, people also become a little less skeptical. So we have a new paper where in 5 studies, we kind of implemented a small tweak in the game that kind of adjusts this. So we can calibrate how skeptical people are in these environments pretty easily. So if we find on a quiz, for example, that people's response pattern is just kind of being skeptical, we say, dude, what are you doing? Right? Not everything is manipulation. Try again. And that kind of puts people in a mindset of accuracy, and that hugely boosts the effect on discernment. So we weren't optimizing for discernment specifically, but we can do that with small tweaks in the game. So here you can see differences without feedback and with feedback, and it makes a massive difference. Whether this is just with regular statistics or signal detection theory, it affects both kind of analyses. We put out handbooks for NATO during the Ukraine conflict, how to do this. The US government is using it. They use it against Putin by preempting the invasion. Sources in intelligence tell, I can't verify this, right? But they say that pre-bunking the invasion and the deepfakes helped delay the invasion in Ukraine. I mean, you could say the pre-bunk didn't work because the war still happened, but if it indeed delayed an attack by a day or two because Putin was bamboozled by the preemptive strike, I think that's still a win for psychology. They keep doing it now, so the government's rolling this out on a larger basis. We have versions in Russia and Ukraine. Gordon, in fact, together with Steve Lewandowski, did fascinating research for the European Commission showing pre-bunking can work on specific topics like climate and COVID. I'm not going to talk about Gord's work, but just to throw it out there. And the last thing I'll say before I stop, and I think this is what Gord wants to talk about, is some of the work we've done with YouTube. So we have other games like Go Viral with the World Health Organization. We were able to reach about 200 million people with this intervention because it became part of the WHO's campaign. We did one with CISA during the elections in the United States, and we keep doing that to try to pre-bunk foreign influence tactics, when you can break those down in a pretty structured format of how to disrupt discourse by using false amplification, polarizing techniques, and things like that. there was a leaked memo on this. This is funny, I think, for the Harvard review. So I advised on this memo saying that two things are certain: the global appeal of cat videos and the pervasiveness of disinformation. This got leaked to some Trump-affiliated organization who came up with the conspiracy that this Cambridge professor works closely with the empirical reviewers at Harvard on psychological inoculation. And so, you know, I'm pulling the strings now with the Biden administration. As I'm sure you know about the lawsuits and everything. Luckily, I'm located in the United Kingdom, so they have no jurisdiction here. But also, guys, these are just games helping to educate people. It's not a conspiracy. So Google said, cool, we can help you because this opt-in stuff, you know, people play games, it's great science experiment, but in the real world, we're going to need to shorten this stuff a lot more. So we're going to do videos, and we're going to take the structure of the inoculation, and we're going to write scripts, you know, warning people in advance, giving them a micro dose of some of the techniques that are found on the platform, and then giving people examples so they can refute it when they actually come across it. And YouTube had well, I should say Google, who owns YouTube, of course, had a brilliant idea, which was that if you could put the pre-bunks in the ad spaces on YouTube, you know, those annoying ads that you can't skip, if you put the videos there, you could scale this across billions of people all at once. And that, I love that idea. I love the idea of doing video. So we started working on that. We did 6 pre-registered studies. Then the reviewers at Science said, you know, we don't believe in survey studies, so do a field experiment. So we had to wait for a year to get Beth Goldberg at Google, who's fantastic and convinced YouTube that we can do this, to actually do a field study. And basically what we did was we randomized people to inoculation or control. This is also with Steve Lewandowski, I should say, who was a big part of the project. And we either expose people to one of the manipulative strategies that are found on places like YouTube, or a neutral paired social media post. So the same version of the post, but that's a neutral version of the manipulative version. And then we want to see if we can help people discern by inoculating against these techniques using some of these videos. And so what are these techniques? So these techniques are things like scapegoating minority groups, ad hominem attacks, incoherence, false dilemmas, the use of negative emotions, to manipulate people. And these videos are very short. They're 30 seconds to 1 minute. So when we tested this in the lab, and I'll show you those results here. This is discernment. Red is discernment, blue is manipulative, and yellow is neutral. So for most of the videos, in fact, all technique recognition discernment goes up, right? People discern between neutral and manipulative very well. They also have greater confidence. They find it less trustworthy, and they want to share it less. Now, sharing was not all significant because there's flooring effects with sharing. People don't tend to self-report that they share a lot of stuff. But overall, this was extremely consistent across all of these techniques and these studies. And then, so here are the effect sizes if people are interested. You can see the effect sizes are quite sizable, right? So we were quite impressed with that. So then we turn to the field, which is the last thing I'll say, and I'll stop talking. So we did a campaign. We had about 1 million views. And YouTube allowed us to sample about 30% randomly for one survey question. We could iterate the question to avoid item effects within 24 hours of being exposed to the video. So in the ad spaces, right, you're polled. So usually they use that for profit, right? So people can advertise brands, and then you randomly get this question: do you remember this brand? So you can't do anything else in this ad space. It's not a psychometric testing facility. So that's all you could do, really. And so what we did was we gave people one of these videos, and then we polled them within 24 hours and looked at whether they can recognize these techniques. And so what are these videos? So Google, said, look, we don't want the weakened dose to be risky, right? So we want something that's an inactivated strain. So how do you do that? So we had to go back to the drawing board and think about what the weakened dose could be. And so we turned to popular culture. So, for example, we used a clip from Star Wars, Revenge of the Sith, right? So Anakin Skywalker is, spoiler alert, who goes on to become Darth Vader, is talking to Obi-Wan and says, either you're with me or you're my enemy. And then Obi-Wan says, only a Sith deals in absolutes. And then the narrator says, like, look, nobody wants to be a Sith, right? Be on the lookout for these dark arts manipulation techniques. Don't use them. Here's how to spot them in the real world. And so we give people items like that, right? So
just a warning that you're a bit over time, Sander, but feel free to wrap up whenever.
Here's my last sentence. is my last sentence. The debate over whether to prioritize combating homelessness or poverty among immigrants continues. Why can't we do both? That's the neutral version. This is the false dilemma actual version. Why give illegal immigrants access to social services? Why should we help illegals when we should be helping homeless Americans instead? That's the manipulative version. And then you don't find these big effect sizes. So this is from the field, from YouTube, about a 5 to 10% boost in people's ability to discern these techniques. Much more modest, but for a brand lift, as they call it, for an ad, it is quite big. And so they continue to roll this out. So Google is now scaling this across populations. So they just did this in Germany using these 3 techniques, reaching over 50% of the German population, more than half of all Germans on social media. And they replicated these effects over and over again in the field for these type of techniques. So that's my propaganda. Gord, please feel free to steal some of my minutes. I'm sorry to go over, and thanks so much for everyone's attention. I look forward to Gord's presentation.
Okay. Wait for good job, Sander.
Thanks. 28 minutes. I mean, it's not that bad for an academic, right?
Was it 20? Okay. I need my slides up on the thing here. All righty. So thanks again, Sander. By the way, first thing I want to say was, again, thanks to Sander for engaging in this. As Brian was saying, it was complete happenstance that we were both asked to give talks to this series, and I was like, hey, it would be fun to, present this argument of inoculation that I've been working on. And it just so happened that Sander was also the week before giving a talk about inoculation. And so we emailed, and then it was like, hey, maybe we should do it together. And that's, I think, maybe a better way to deal with these kind of disputes. And so the way that it actually happened, and there's a picture of me and Sander here on the screen, is I was reviewing one of their papers, I think it was around the summertime, and it was one of the really interesting findings that they had there was that when you inoculate against a particular tactic, then like say emotional language use, then it works for that tactic, but it doesn't like carry over magically to when like content that has ad hominem attacks, and which makes a lot of sense, because if you inoculate it against vaccines, or if you get a vaccine that's against that's for like COVID, it's not going to work for the flu or whatever, right? But for some reason, I had this idea in my mind about inoculation as being a kind of general, almost like a critical thinking kind of intervention that would carry over. And then I realized that like if it's that specific, then maybe there might be some issues with that element of it, and that's what led me to this. So Dave Rand is here in the room, and he's on the slide. So we were kind of working on this together. So, okay. The other thing that I think is important to talk to actually get this right is that, as Sandra was mentioning, these are extremely popular interventions. Like I think so. Google has already administered some version of psychological inoculation to millions of people. It'll be hundreds of millions of people, I think, probably by the end of next year. It eventually could be billions of people, and they have the means to do it, and they are really into that. Other social media companies are doing the same thing. And so we have to get it right. We have to know if it's actually what the outcome of that is likely to be. Okay. And so I'm actually going to play this. This is I should have stopped you while you're describing it, but I'm going to play one of these short ones. And before I play it, I want to make one thing clear about my argument. The inoculations that I'm talking about are the scaled ones. So the ones that are short enough, the video form ones, it could be short, non-video form, but it has to be short enough that many millions of people can see it, okay? And so that's not the games necessarily, or long form sort of inoculation things. I'm not really talking about that. I'm just talking about the scaled type stuff, and specifically the ones that are looking at manipulation techniques, okay? And so this is an example of one of those that was created by Google, I think.
You might think about skipping this ad. Don't. What happens next will make you tear up. Wait, you're still here? I mean, great, looks like the trick worked. You see, when watching videos or browsing online, you are likely to encounter content that is loaded with emotional language, and with good reason. Playing into emotions, especially negative ones, such as fear, anger, or contempt, to get you to pay attention to something when you otherwise wouldn't. It's likely that's a big reason why you're still watching this ad, is because you were lured in by our use of emotional language in the very first sentence. Research has shown that expressing emotion is key for the spread of moral and especially political ideas in social networks. So let's say when you're writing a headline and you're trying your hardest to manipulate your readers to click, one thing you can do is pepper your headlines with a bunch of emotionally charged words. Call it a horrific accident instead of a serious one, a disgusting ruling instead of a disagreeable one, or a heartbreaking twist of fate instead of an unfortunate coincidence. That way, you're likely to reach more people and influence the reactions. So let's see how this plays out in real life. Let's take the following headline from the movie Anchorman. No emotional manipulation at play here, just to the point, no nonsense coverage of such an important event in history. This headline, on the other hand, see what they did there? The writer used an emotionally charged word like revolting to describe a whole group of people. Are mutants people? Oh well, you get the point. They're fear-mongering. So whenever you feel outraged or angry, remember, someone may be pulling your strings. Don't be manipulated. Truth Labs, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Okay. By the way, Sander, no one can see your face but me in the room, just so you know that. So you don't have to like constantly think, just so you know. Okay, so
you read my mind.
by the way, yeah. So I thought that I think it's cool. I mean, it's a good video. I think it makes good points. Here's the issue. When you have something like this, the way that actually will be applied by people is through a heuristic. That is, what they're learning is be skeptical of things where you're using this emotional language. And it's a minute and a half, so you can't expect them to have a very elaborate understanding of that. What that will do, I'll argue and I'll show some data, is make people skeptical of things that contain emotional language, but are true, that are things that you don't want people to disbelieve, okay? Here's an example. US deaths near 100,000 and the calculable loss. This is about COVID. This was pretty well known New York Times article, and they just published the names of people who died due to COVID. Very emotional. I think some people probably cried when they saw the headline, actually. And it's true. There's not, I mean, the facts of the matter are true. The names are there. Now, whether you think this is a manipulation technique really depends on your perspective, right? If you are somebody who is skeptical of COVID, you can see that maybe that's manipulative. If you think that it's actually a problem, it's perfectly legitimate as a thing that you'd put on the New York Times. Here's another example that we found last night. The climate time bomb is ticking. The world is running out of time to avoid catastrophe. New UN report warns. Now that contains very scary language, but perhaps it's appropriate, right? Because it is actually a catastrophe that could be happening. This is from The Guardian. Gun-related deaths of US children are rising at an alarming rate. I think it is probably, right? But that is an emotional word. And if you look on the side, like this was just from today, it happens to be that these are the ones that are on the side of the screen. Earth on verge of 5 catastrophic points. Texas woman files emergency lawsuit, et cetera, et cetera. And horrific is one of the examples from the video, and this is something that's actually used. Some things actually are horrific. And so this is the real reason to say that you shouldn't believe the thing. Now, that's not what the video says directly, but that is a consequence of the video, as I'm going to argue, okay, of this sort of thing. It make people skeptical of things that they shouldn't be skeptical of. And that's emotional language, but you could use other examples. As Tucker Carlson created the most racist show in history of cable news, it's quite possible, but you could see that someone might think this is an ad hominem attack, right? New Hampshire shows how deeply rooted Trump's fraud lies are. Donald Trump's war on truth confronts another test with voters. New charges against Trump's focus on lies. Scholars see an authoritarian playbook, et cetera, et cetera. I could give millions of examples of this. Now, the key point is this. Things that often have techniques that you might associate with misinformation. But we often don't want people to disbelieve those things, okay? And so the logic, just to kind of back up to what the logic of inoculation is as I see it, and we'll see if, I think Sander would agree with this in general, is that the idea is you teach people to spot tactics that are specific, that are using misinformation, that so they're better able to identify misinformation without having to teach them specific facts, okay? One other thing I should have mentioned is that I'm not also talking about pre-bunking, about like giving people specific facts, you know, where it's like, you're gonna watch out for this election fraud stuff. I'm talking about just technique-based inoculation, okay? Now, in order to demonstrate that this is going to work at scale, you need two things. First is you have to identify tactics that are both prevalent and diagnostic of misinformation, right? So that it has to be common enough that there's a big enough effect that there actually has something that occurs in the world, and it has to be more prevalent for things that are misinformation, things that are not misinformation, okay? And they have to be simple enough that people can actually learn heuristics to identify them in like a minute and a half if you're gonna scale it, okay? And what the research has done, quite effectively, I would say, is they focused on B. They focused on finding ways to teach people how to, you know, in certain kind of complicated things, to simplify it so that they can identify these heuristics, and they've demonstrated that people can actually learn that. But the critical part to know if it scales is actually A, and that has not been established, okay? And what this ultimately question, right? And so nothing that I'm gonna argue here is about criticizing the actual studies that Sandra's talking about. In terms of the methods or all the other kind of stuff, that we could take that totally at face value, and I think there would still be a major problem with scaling inoculation, okay? And that's what I'm gonna argue today. Okay, so Sandra mentioned this paper. I think I'm gonna show you how these things are tested, just to kind of make this more crystallized for you. Okay, so here's what Sandra mentioned. It's a manipulative post. This is what they use in this experiment to illustrate something where emotional language is used in a manipulative way. Now, I'm not actually sure if this was if it happened or not. And it's kind of not in terms of the study itself. It's just not. It's beside the point. The point of the study is to see if people can recognize that emotional language is being used here. Somebody, okay. And so the neutral post, which is the thing that doesn't contain the tactic, there's no emotional language. Okay. And so the paradigm is that you give people the video that I showed you, and what that does is it helps people identify the difference between these two things. And when I say the difference, with what they're being specifically recognizing, is this a manipulative thing or not? So you're asking them directly, hey, is this manipulative? And when you get the inoculation, you say, yes, it's more manipulative after having seen it than if you didn't see the video or you saw some different video. Okay, and then so they looked at several different techniques. Okay, emotional language is the one that I have on the screen. Okay, so that's the idea. Now, what I'm going to do is try to steelman inoculation and then explain how, even if you take these assumptions, we still have major problems at scaling. Okay, the first assumption that I want you to take is that let's assume that if you ask people directly, hey, is this manipulative? That effect size carries over to the real world where they have to spontaneously recognize whether something is manipulative, okay? Which already is probably unlikely. And we don't actually know what that gap is because we don't have any field studies where outcome, we don't know if someone thinks it's manipulative. We have to ask them in many cases, and makes them think about it. And so it's hard to know if they'll spontaneously recognize whether it's manipulative, okay? You might look at something like whether they share less manipulative stuff after the fact or whatever, but those studies have not been run. What we can assume, just for the sake of argument, that there's no decay over time. I think it probably is compared to other interventions, one that does last much longer than other things. But just for the sake of my effect size I'm going to talk about, forget about that element of the issue. And let's assume that you own YouTube and you're going to show everyone this video and that you can scale it. So that there's no problems, which is the thing that's actually happening, okay? So there's no problems with scaling. The issue here is only about what would happen if it were scaled. We can just assume that the effect size works the same for everybody all the time, forever, and everybody could get the inoculation. Okay, what would happen? So here's the kind of general idea in the way that I think about how this works. So you have been inoculated, you've seen the video on YouTube or whatever it was, and you come across a news headline that looks like this. It says, decorated Democrat arrested and charged with 6 heinous crimes. It contains emotional language. It's a false thing, and you're like, hey, I learned about that. Now I'm not gonna share this. I'm not gonna believe it. Right on. And that's a win. That's the idea. Okay. Now, if you have the same claim, it doesn't have emotional language. You're not gonna be any better at recognizing that that's false, right? And there's no theory within inoculation that would suggest. In fact, it would be weird if it happened. Okay, because there's nothing here that there's no emotional language use. So you don't magically become better at recognizing that that's false because it's not related to what you learned, okay? But the issue that I'm going to raise is that things that are true, as I mentioned, can also have emotional language. So here's an example. A crisis for Democrats as Biden's poll numbers tumble. His numbers were tumbling, and I think some people would have called that a crisis. That contains emotional language. It doesn't, it would be better maybe if we lived in a world that news headlines that think were true didn't have this sort of wording, but that's not the world we live in. So what I expect to happen, and what I'm going to show you data that's showing, is that people are not going to believe this claim either because it contains emotional language, because they just learned if it has emotional language, maybe we should be skeptical about that. Okay, they're going to apply it equally categories because you haven't taught them about what's true or false. What you've taught them is if it has emotional language, you should be skeptical of that. Okay, and so this is an experiment that we do with Steve Lewandowski and Beth Goldberg, who Sandra mentioned, and we gave people true and false news headlines that varied in terms of whether they had an emotional tactic or not. Okay, and so like the ones I'm showing you here. Okay, and we asked people in this case whether they believed them. Okay, we have another study where we asked them if they thought they're manipulative, which gives you a larger effect size, but it's the same sort of finding. And so this is the differences here. So that is for the true and false headlines that are high emotion, people believe them less after the inoculation. It's not, I mean, in this case, it's not the biggest effect of all time, but you still get the effect. Then you can see it here. So basically, like people are, if anything, the effect is a little bit larger for true, right? Meaning that when there's an emotional manipulation and the headline is true, after the inoculation, people are skeptical of it, right? And this to the same extent that they're skeptical of the things that are false, right? Because we haven't magically taught them what's true or false. We just taught them to identify what has the tactic or not, okay? So that's that kind of underlying element of inoculation works in the way that I think about it. So the question then becomes, how can we apply an effect size that you get in one of these psychology studies to the real world? Okay, so let's assume we'll take the upper limit of that YouTube study that Sandra mentioned of 10%. Okay, so we know that we showed them a video. Now they're 10% better at recognizing, let's say emotional language. Now, for that to have a 10% improvement on the world, you have to assume this, right? That all of the false or misleading stuff that you want to inoculate against contains the tactic that you are teaching people about. So emotional language, for example, all right? And so therefore, if you have a 10% improvement in people's ability to recognize the tactic is a 10% improvement in the world, right? But now that's not the world we live in though. Let's assume instead that, let's say 50% of the false stuff contains emotional language, or sorry, 80% of the false stuff contains emotional language, but like say 50% of the true stuff does, okay? These numbers are based on something, and I'll explain how I got the numbers in a second, or several minutes, I guess. So what's the true effect size in this case? Well, 80%, a 10% reduction for the 80% of stuff that's false and contains emotional language is an 8% reduction, but you're also getting a 5% reduction for the 50% of true stuff, right? And so your overall benefit here is actually 3%. So you just have, you have to kind of, that's the actual real world effect of the intervention, if you think about it that way. Now, but there's another big problem here though, which is that this is a world where people see an equal amount of true and false stuff, which is that's the kind of world that when we do studies, we usually have that. But that's not the real world. People do not see an equal amount of true and false stuff. This is a study from Andy Guess and colleagues. This is like, there's lots of different ones I could have cited here, but this is exposure to untrustworthy websites during the 2016 election. And you can see that like most people are like well below 15%, right? Most people see a tiny fraction of the stuff that they see is false, right? Very few people are at 50%. I mean, this is untrustworthy. It's not exactly true false, but you can just bear with me on that, that switch. But it's just on most analyses, like if you just scroll through social media, it's going to matter of percentage. It's not going to be more than 15% usually. And some people are in these really dense misinformation environments, but not many people are, okay? So in reality, it's more like this, right? Where there's a lot more of the stuff that you see is true. And in fact, this is probably even overrepresenting how much false stuff people see. But what that means is, if you see something that contains emotional language, it's much more likely to be true than false. And so if you teach people, hey, don't believe, or if they take from what you teach, don't believe things that have emotional language, it's more likely to lead to a decrease in belief in true than a decrease in belief in false. You have backfire, okay? That's a negative outcome overall. Another way to think about this is, here, imagine you were inoculated and now each rectangle is a piece of content that you saw. So the inoculation is active for 100 pieces of content after you see the thing, and 15% of those things are false, right? And so let's now assume 80% of the false things have emotional language. They're the thing that was inoculated against, and like 47% of the true things, just to get the squares to be equal, contain emotional language if they're true. And so if you reduce a 10% reduction due to inoculation and belief in these things, that's one less headline for the false things, but actually 4 less for the true thing. So you're actually 4 times worse off in this world than you wouldn't have been if you were not inoculated, okay? So the question then is, what's the reality? Like, I made up some numbers. This is a hypothetical world where 80% of the stuff that people see that's false is emotional language. So like, where did I get that number from? So let's ask our friendly neighborhood LLM to answer this question for us. And I mean, you could take some of these numbers with a grain of salt. I've got some other numbers in here too. But so here's what we did. We wanted to look at we looked at the tactics that were in this Science Advances paper, and we just gave it a simple prompt. All these things, like Sanders identified major, like they have Wikipedia pages about these things. Like these are not minor things. It's just that we don't know how common they are, essentially. Okay. And so what we did is we asked ChatGPT, we fed it the stimuli from this experiment that like were selected by Sander and colleagues that in emotional language or they don't, et cetera. And this is the accuracy. So basically, according to at least this data set, ChatGPT was pretty good at recognizing emotionality. It correctly classified all the ones that were in the study. So if it was a participant, it would be really good, right? It wasn't great at the incoherence one for neutral, so take that with a grain of salt, but yeah, okay? So we have some reason to believe that maybe it's okay at doing this job. And I think at least for the emotional language, like that's kind of something that it would be good at because it's pretty easy to recognize that. It's just that what words are emotional versus not. Okay, so we gave it 2 different types of headline sets. One was from the Mercury Project, which is collaboration. Some of the people in the room are involved, et cetera. But basically, these are just like headlines that I selected that they're false. Also, the misleading ones are from Don Rosenbeek. I don't know exactly how he selected them, but I think they mostly came from fact-checking websites. Okay, and the true ones are just from legitimate mainstream sources. Okay, another set, it comes from Kevin Aslett and colleagues, and what they did was really interesting. They took really popular websites. They took the most viral articles from those websites over a period of like weeks, and then let them fact checked. Okay, so these are like the type of thing that people would actually see because they're the most popular like shared articles. Okay, and so here's what the results look like. So for the Mercury Project headlines, this was why I was giving you those numbers. The emotional language is like 80% of the false, but around 50% of the true contains emotional language. So very prevalent, but not diagnostic, right? There's a pretty small difference between the true and false. There is like a meaningful correlation there, but it's just not that diagnostic. For the Aslett ones, the gap is actually smaller. And these are the ones that are popular. So there's lots of emotional language in these headlines, but the true ones also have a lot of emotional language based on what GPT-4 said, at least. Ad hominem does not seem to be very common, which is, I think, probably consistent with what I would think. Scapegoating is, I think it's probably overestimating like how often scapegoating is happening in these headlines, but that's just what it said. It says basically false dichotomies don't exist in this data set, which doesn't seem totally implausible to me. And then incoherence. Okay, so none of these things are particularly common, and the gap between the true and false is not hugely great in any of them. So like the best case scenario based on this analysis looks like this, and you're still in backfire territory for scapegoating in that case. Okay, but there's other study people have looked at this sort of thing. Paul et al. They looked at classifiers that looked at rhetorical appeals. So this is like set of fallacies, and all you need to take away from this is that like there is a correlation. These fallacies are certainly more common for false things than for true things, but the gaps are not as big as they need to be for this to be an effective intervention at scale. Here's another one from Carrasco-Ferry. This is a huge set of headlines, and they're using sentiment analysis. So like, how good does emotion words help you identify whether something is like clickbait or conspiracy theory? And then this is like basically the accuracy rate. So it's helping you a little bit, but again, not so much that it saves the idea. And so this is a website made by Linden, who's sitting right here. And we have the QR code because Dave wanted me to put it on the thing. And so here's what we can do with this website. You can toggle the factors and see where you stand. Okay, so because it could be the case is, okay, what if you're able to? So let's assume that this 80% of false things contain the tactic. This is what I had for the emotional content. Let's assume that's okay. So how much false content do you have to see for this to be not a backfire? If you toggle this up, you have to get to around 40% before it becomes positive. So you have to be in a really dense misinformation environment for this to actually work out under these assumptions of prevalence in terms of the tactic. Now, of course, if you say, oh, there's way more false stuff, then it's going to be less, right? If you have to, and then you can play around with it. Fine. So that is one way to kind of check this out. One way to think about whether these things would actually be effective. Now, it is hard to know exactly what people's information environment is going to be, but you can toggle it around. And if it's a case that people see way more true stuff than false stuff, you need a really super diagnostic tactics, and I don't think there are any that exist, frankly. Okay. And by the way, and this is all I had these other assumptions. We add these things in here. Probably it's very small undetectable effect or backfire is what I would expect based on the outcomes, at least in terms of identifying true versus false stuff, which might not be the most important thing, and maybe that's what me and Sandra can talk about. But that is a potential consequence of what this would be. Okay. So here are the conclusions. The first is that whether this is successful in the wild, at least successful in terms of improving the quality of people's beliefs, it depends entirely on whether the thing that you're inoculated against is prevalent and diagnostic of false or problematic content. Okay, and if you put problematic in there, then it's true for a wider range of things. And what I'd venture is that if you find something that is common, that it's prevalent for false content, it's not going to be diagnostic, because it will also be probably common for true things, like emotional language. If you find something that's really diagnostic of false content, it's not going to be very common. And so it's unlikely to have a very strong effect at scale. Okay. I wanted to mention that Dan Williams he's a philosopher. He's also been making very similar arguments. In fact, like Sandra must be getting bored of this topic because he's been arguing with Dan and other people about this on Twitter for the last few days. Then we've been involved in these conversations. And so, by the way, that's another point I want to make, is that absolutely spectacular that we're able to engage on these issues. And I have to, full respect to Sandra for engaging with this and talking about it together. So thanks for listening. So now Sandra has some more slides. I don't know if I have to unshare or what I have to do, but
Yeah, thanks so much, Gord. Can people still hear me?
yeah, you're on the big screen now.
Yeah, the big screen. Okay, yeah, no, that was great. First of all, I was talking to Cass Sunstein the other day. He's visiting Cambridge, and he's talking about, oh, people say nudging, sometimes it doesn't work, sometimes it does work. Is small effects, is it null? And he sort of talked about this idea of, well, most people who go fishing don't catch any fish. And it's like, that doesn't mean you shouldn't go fishing. It just means that you have to find a better way to catch the fish. And I think, in the spirit of that metaphor, I really, as you said, so many people are using this. I do absolutely think it's so important that we find the best way possible of doing it. So I think one important finding that I'll switch to my slides in a second, but that Gordon didn't show here in his fantastic study was actually that you solve this problem really easily, assuming that, I don't think it's a problem, but taking Gord's view that is a problem, you add an accuracy nudge on top of the inoculation. So in their own study, they showed that by, and do tell me if I'm wrong, Gord, when you put the accuracy nudge with the inoculation, so the best of both worlds, it actually boosted true-false discernment more than either the accuracy nudge or the inoculation on its own. So similarly in the games, when people think, could you make people too skeptical? We can tweak it a little bit, right? Give people a little bit of feedback, get them back on the right path as to what they're supposed to pay attention to. You can really boost discernment that way. So those are just two practical thoughts that if you are concerned about this, they're easy tweaks that you could implement and scale it widely that I would fully endorse. We're doing this with Meta now, together with Dave. And one of the things that I said was that, when we're going to roll out the videos, make sure to put the accuracy nudge on top, because then you get both benefits of technique recognition and discernment. But I do want to take a couple of minutes, Gordon, and then I'll pass to you to present a more philosophical disagreement.
Actually, can I clarify one thing before you start, just on that one study?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that is when we combine the two, the effect was in a world where all of the false things contain emotional language, and all of the true things contained not emotional language. So we got an
I see,
overall
yeah,
improvement in
base rate.
discernment, but it was because we created an environment where those things were met. Yeah, because we were doing the studies where they were unmatched and we could not get an overall effect because it's not specific.
Yeah, that's an important clarification. So coming back to this point about the base rate and the diagnostic criteria, because I think that's really the crux of Gord's story, right? That there's this the prevalence of these techniques needs to be so much higher in false content than true content for it to be diagnostic. I actually thought the percentages were quite impressive and this is pretty consistent, right? We know that false content or misleading content contains more of these techniques than true content. It's just about how high it needs to be. I think that is only relevant in a framework where you care about what's true or false, or where you can even realistically construe categories of true and false. So my take on this is that these logical fallacies have been known for over 2,000 years in their documentation, and they are fallacious no matter who uses them or for what purpose. So if real news uses these techniques, it isn't real news, okay? So the idea is that if this technique is being deployed by mainstream media, people shouldn't get distrustful of the mainstream media. That's also what studies find. People get more skeptical of the headlines, but not necessarily of the source or the institution. People are correctly calibrating. If I see an alarmist headline from a news outlet that is generally credible, then people are completely justified to calibrate their judgments into finding this a little less reliable because it uses a known manipulation technique. I don't care whether that's a real source or a fake source or whatever label we want to put on it. In abstract, this is always an undesirable epistemological feature. And so that is really the core of it. And so the idea is that yes, sometimes real or fake outlets will use it, but it actually changes how we should think about the headline. Maybe it isn't as true as it could be if it had been reported differently. It's trying to influence you in ways that distract you from the evidence. So our measurements are not, do you now believe this as true or false? So people try to force this paradigm of true false on some of these studies, right? But it is almost the exact opposite of what we're trying to do. We're trying to tell people, don't think in terms of true or false. Think in terms of how reliable you find this on a dimension, right? We want a nuanced space where people have opportunity to express these nuances. And this is also premised on the idea, right, that news outlets should adhere to principles of objectivity and neutrality. So anything that deploys emotional manipulation, polarization, extremism deviates from what we should expect of good editorial practice. And I'll show you some empirical data in just a second. The other thing is that social media companies, and the reasons why they focus on this is because they aren't concerned about this true-false dichotomy either. So they outsource stuff that's fact-checked to fact-checkers. What they are concerned about is misleading opinions that are expressed in posts. You have podcasts, political extremists on YouTube, things you cannot easily fact-check as true or false, but that contain manipulation. Whether it's a good source or a bad source or a charismatic person or not, right? They don't care. They just want to empower people to spot manipulation. And that's the same aim that we have. And that's, manipulations. I often tell people, look, just because your mother is using a manipulation technique to try to get you to do something, that doesn't make it better, right? And that's really the idea. And these companies know the prevalence of these techniques on their own platforms. So maybe in the abstract, we don't know, right? But they know that in certain YouTube rabbit holes, in certain spaces on Facebook, that these techniques are prevalent. And they wanted to target the people, right? And so we're not there yet in being able to target them, but that's the idea. So, with Meta, we focus on these techniques like cherry picking data on climate, right? Or single cause fallacy, because they know from their data that these techniques are problematic on their platform, regardless of who uses them. The thing with emotions, right? So people keep going on about the emotion fallacy. It is not all emotions, right? So we're focusing on the appeal to emotion fallacy. which is always fallacious in my point of view. So the idea here, this is from our game. Apparently, I was ruining the planet, keeping my baby warm. It's distracting you from the evidence of climate change with an emotional appeal that is irrelevant. So those are the examples that we're focusing on. It's true, and I talked about this with Gordon, that when you do this with social media companies, you know, they want sort of cartoon versions of the actual stuff because of concerns around legal lawsuits and misinformation. And so you can't really do the heavy stuff. And that's a shame, because I do agree that we want the fallacies to be as close to the real thing as possible, but sometimes we're one step removed. But let me show you some examples today. This took me 2 minutes. False dichotomies, right? Let me show you false dichotomies on social media. There's hundreds and hundreds of these on actual social media. Soapbit says you can't be pro-Israel without being anti-Palestine. Pro-Israel is pro-genocide. Anti-Palestine. Just a reminder, if you're pro-Israel, it means you're racist and genocidal. Noah is very clearly pro-Israel, which means he's anti-Palestine. Now the other side. Pro-Palestine really just means anti-Israel. Sir, you are pro-Palestine, which means you're naturally anti-Israel. The idea here is that I don't care who Heather is. I don't care who Soapbit is. It's a false dichotomy. It is always a bad thing to use in an argument. We want to empower people on social media to discern these false dichotomies. Here are the neutral versions, which also exist on social media. Pro-Palestine means pro-Palestine and not anti-Israel. I am pro-Palestine and pro-Israel, right? And so I believe that this can be done. Now, this is just examples and anecdotes. The last thing, Gord, let me show you some data. This is data from the media bias chart people who document hundreds of thousands of websites according to political slant, reliability, and deployment of these techniques. So here we go. This is ad hominem in real, actual media. Most of it is overwhelmingly deployed by low-quality outlets. So the space here are the most reliable outlets. So these are high-effort original reporting. Almost none of them use this type of technique. There is some in mixed news reporting, in opinion, right? The high variability type of reporting. It's true that our interventions would catch this type of stuff, and some of that stuff might also be partly true. The bulk of it, though, is at the bottom, particularly on the right, but also a little bit on the left. And so there are big discriminatory boundaries between what outlets use these techniques. Here's scapegoating, very similar pattern, right? The reliable outlets, they don't use these type of techniques because they don't have to, right? But the low quality ones do. Here is conspiracy. What's interesting is that this one, they do this over time too. It goes up a little bit in here. I think this has to do with Israel-Gaza, that actually some of the mainstream outlets are also now using slightly conspiratorial language. Is this a problem for our interventions? No, because if mainstream outlets are using conspiratorial language, we want people to know about it and calibrate their judgments accordingly. I agree that we don't want to sow distrust of the media in general. That's why I think it's important that we improve things with accuracy nudges, with feedback, right, to avoid that type of backfire. But the headline type of judgments, I'm not concerned about. So that's my response. I'll say this is based, we've done studies with Gord's headlines too, actually. So these are not using the techniques that people are trained on with our game, just the headlines from Dave and Gord. You find discernment, but very small. As Gord was saying, transference is lower, right? That if you give people fake true headlines that don't use these techniques, then you can't expect inoculation to do much, but it does do a little bit. We've also done some agent-based models, varying the base rate and things. And we find that in complex social interactions, the base rate actually matters less than what you would expect from just reasoning your way through it. But of course, it depends on the assumptions that go into the model. Gord, thanks again. I think this is fascinating. Happy to hear your thoughts.
You said 2 slides, Sander.
I know. Misleading. Yeah. It was a misleading tactic. I'm less reliable now. Less reliable.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. Okay, first thing I want to say as a kind of simple point, which is when you show the figures of like different news sources, the critical thing is the base rate. What do people actually see? So that displays all the different sources. But if you see most of the stuff in the middle, then it still does not invalidate the argument whatsoever. The other issue is this. I mean, I'm gonna read off some titles here from papers that you guys have written. Fake news game confers psychological resistance against online misinformation, against fake news about COVID-19. Fake news game actively inoculating against the risk of misinformation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I think readers, and this is your book, which I have not read, Sander. I'm sorry. I haven't read any books. I read Game of Thrones at night, but I think people might be surprised to find that you don't care about truth versus falsity in doing these interventions. That it's because it's framed within the confines of that, and we would say, okay, well, misinformation can be defined differently, but generally speaking, when people are talking about misinformation or certainly fake news, it relates to truth versus falsity. So, but one thing we can agree on is this: if you were to create some sort of intervention that helps people identify manipulation techniques, I could, in principle, be like that. I'm not really opposed to that as an empirical reality. That is, like, maybe that's you can do that with efficacy, and maybe there are some techniques that are really problematic. But you have to make that case. You have to be able to say that, and you have to be also able to the possibility that that could make people not believe things that are true, which is a legitimate concern. Okay, you can imagine people, and not about trust in sources, just that it might be that when you go back to headlines like this, people might be like, wait a second, maybe COVID isn't killing that many people because they've done the thing. You have to be able to rule that out as a possibility. You can't just wipe it away. It's a legitimate concern, and so that's my general response to that. But I think we should leave some room for questions from the crowd and all.
Yeah, yeah. I'll
shut
up.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. How do we do this? If do I call people in person, or how do you? Yeah, there's a question here. Can Sandra see them? Yeah, she had her hand up first. I don't know if you want to take. Yeah. What can you see, Sandra? Can you see the crowd?
I cannot, but I'm happy for you to read the question, and you can take it first if you want.
Well, someone has a mic, so they're gonna. Yeah. Okay, great.
There we go. Hi. I feel like I'm a retired journalist, professional social engineer, hacker, marketing VP. I've done all of the manipulative bits, but I like to think of myself as a white hat as far as that goes. The thing I'm not hearing in your studies and arguments that seems to me to be the elephant in the room is the financial incentives for clickbait. This is something that's true in journalism. It's true in YouTube algorithms that creators use to create their headlines and their thumbnails. It's in every part of society. So how do you factor in that good people, Machiavellian, if you will, are incentivized to load the emotional content up front?
Is this the question for me or for Sander? Okay. What I would say rapidly to that is that I think it's a major concern. The perspective I'm taking, just to kind of put in context, is given the world that we live in, what would happen if we did this inoculation thing? And given that clickbait is an issue, and like the use of emotional language to get people to click on headlines is common, then people might not believe claims that they see in the headlines, and that would be a problem. But I think Sandra would probably agree that, like, if we could remove this issue, if we could actually produce stronger, more neutral language, and then maybe we would eventually live in a world where this sort of thing would actually be hugely beneficial. But I don't think we live in that world, unfortunately. Sandra?
Yeah, that's the crux, right? That we don't live in that world, and so you catch some stuff that's driven by clickbait, but I think that's desirable, whereas I think your perspective is that you're more worried that that's not desirable. I agree that if all the news was more neutral and balanced, then this would be much more effective in your view, because it cuts more across false than true, whereas I see the news that is clickbaity as also kind of not true, even though there might be some veracity in there, because we're not helping people think true false, we're helping them think reliability, right? And so if a clickbaity BBC headline. So to answer the question, I often get asked this, right? Because people will say, "Oh, you focused on COVID. Why are you not calling out the climate alarmist people and so on?" And it's sort of like, well, if there is a headline from the BBC that says we're all going to die tomorrow of climate change, that is a manipulation technique. Okay, we're not all going to die tomorrow. That's not what the science says. That's an emotionally manipulative headline. Doesn't mean we shouldn't trust the BBC. It means we should now find that headline a little less reliable, even though they might quote factual studies in the article. And I'm perfectly fine with that. I think it empowers people. I think it is a good thing. But I think the reason why we see this is because of financial clickbait incentives. I think a lot of good outlets that are doing good work are driven by the wrong financial incentives, and that's why they have to make these headlines less quote unquote true than or neutral than they could be.
Okay, question from online.
Okay.
We have a question from Aya Salim for Gordon. Given that you find this backfire, do you believe that there's a different tactic to correct misinformation that is more realistic in the real world?
To correct misinformation? Well, I think pre-bunking it is actually really great. Like that is specific pre-bunks that give you material facts. The issue that I see is that I don't think we haven't developed evidence yet, and I don't think it's possible that you can take surface level features of something and use that as a heuristic for identifying whether it's true or false. What you need to do to or false is use information about the world. You need contextual factors. And even in the case of whether something's manipulative, to know whether it's manipulative, you need the contextual factors. And so you can't just ignore that part. So using pre-bunks, and Sandra has done work on this as well, where you give people material facts that help them add context to the claims that they're seeing, I think that's great. Whether you want to call that inoculation, that's fine, but it's just, it's the surface level features is the issue that I take. So, yeah.
Yeah, my quick 2 cents addition would be that I think it's great that we're being nuanced now about, there's so many different ways to inoculate and some work better than others. So I think it's great that we're zooming in on this nuance. The technique level ones are the most scalable, and so that's where a lot of the attention is. So for me, the example you gave, so I disagree with philosophers and I disagree on this point. So the example that I gave earlier, either you're pro-Palestine or you're pro-Israel, I don't need to know any context about the war. This is a false dichotomy that exists on its own without the need for any context. So I strongly believe that in many of the examples, these are falsities or false equivalence statements that can be deduced quite readily with minimal context. And that's kind of what we're focusing on. I agree, though, in the stuff that I see now with the scaling of this, though, and I will say they're reducing this to like 30-second videos, 10-second videos. I become, and I've expressed this concern to social media companies that, you need some context for the inoculation, right? It can't be so short because all you're telling people is that emotions are bad, for example. I mean, that's not the right idea. You want to explain the appeal to emotion fallacy, not just tell people, warn them of fake news and tell them it's bad. You have to give people the actual skill to identify in advance a particular fallacy, because they all have the same structure. They all have the same psychological template. And so you help people see it regardless of what the context is. I agree that context can be sometimes helpful, but as I am equally concerned that scaling it in such a minimal form is not leaving much room for skill building. So that's kind of my concern.
There's one thing to add to that is that I would say that things that a fallacy that is there and the context doesn't matter is not consequential. So, yeah.
Okay. First of all, thank you both for this. This has been really interesting. So it seems like a large part of this debate hinges on the extent to which the presence of these manipulation tactics is predictive of whether information is true or false. And I would imagine that that is true to varying degrees depending on the area of public discourse. So to give you an example of what I mean, like the information environment around elections and campaigns is so polarized that you expect candidates to be using these techniques regardless of how true their statements are, but we still have to care whether their statements are true. But then on the other hand, for public health messaging for things like COVID vaccines, you've got government institutions saying things like, vaccines are your best chance to stay safe and healthy because they reduce your likelihood of getting COVID by whatever %. And then on the other hand, you have people using really emotionally valent statements like, this is a government plot to kill
Yeah,
you
right.
and to cull the population and you will die. And so that seems like an area of public discourse where that could be more predictive. And I'm wondering if there's been any effort to kind of disambiguate different arenas of public discourse and find whether they're more or less predictive depending on the context.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, that is, if you could target it to context in which what I would say is 100%, my argument is not actually that it's impossible to scale these things. We just have to we have to find evidence that it could work by doing that sort of work. And the focus is not on that at present, and so it should be.
Yeah, well, so I would say some of it is.
You had a question. So yeah, but I mean, like that is, yeah, it's like that. It has not the primary focus of the stuff, but once that is all published, and then that's what we'll see. Sorry, there's a thing from the, yeah.
Yep, we've got so many questions from online. The next question is Philbert, who asks, the estimates of the frequency with which the different types of headlines, true, false, and misleading, use different tactics seem to be based on the assumption that these headlines are representative of real-world headlines that fit into these categories. The questions around whether or not these are representative.
Yeah, we had two different sets. The one set was the Aslett and colleagues one. That was from Kevin Aslett. And so those ones were the most popular websites, the most popular articles from the most popular websites. And so that is representative in the sense that those are the types of things that people are most likely to see because they're being shared most broadly. So that, to some extent, that would be representative of what people are likely to see. But of course, it might differ based on who it is and all that. But so that one's more representative, yeah. I would say, at least it has some modicum of representativeness. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other one is.
Well, one quick addition for me is that, for me, one of the issues, and I mean, maybe Gordon and I disagree on that, is that, we know from tons of studies, right, that fact-check news is only false news, is a tiny minority of the types of stuff that people see. So that's why I'm not concerned with what's fact-checked as true or false, because nobody almost sees that stuff. What's much bigger is misleading content, right? That makes up a much bigger majority of what people see online, and it can be misleading to various degrees. So that's practically why I think it's more relevant to focus on these misleadingness techniques, because inoculation isn't that helpful for true false content, right? So if I tell you that a video you saw is fake, what else can we say? It was fake, right? So there's nothing to inoculate there. So I think, the CDC headline, for example, that from Jennifer Allen's study, that uses the correlation implies causation fallacy, which to my mind is always wrong, no matter what the context is, right? And that is much more damaging to public opinion, even that's a real article. But it still uses a misleading technique. But I do agree that it's helpful to focus on the context. So with Meta, we're doing climate stuff. So we're zooming in on the techniques in the climate domain, which is a hybrid version where you can be a bit more specific, because with the YouTube's one, they are very general. So you're cutting across lots of stuff, and prevalence might be different. In the context of extremism, there's a playbook, right? Identify vulnerable target, isolate them from their friends and family, gain their trust, activate them to do something bad. That's almost unique to extremist organizations. Charities, they don't go around separating Gord from his spouse and getting him to donate tons to the charity, right? So there are domains where this discrimination, I think, is very sharp, and others where it's a bit more blurry.
Oh, no, he had his hand up at the very start here, so I feel bad about. Oh, sorry. Oh no, sorry. You already had the mic. I didn't see that. So
no worries.
I'm gonna pull the mic from you, but okay. We're gonna get to your question. I feel bad. I've ignored you too many times.
So Kai Kupferschmidt, I'm a science journalist. Briefly, but basically, I really struggle with the emotional language part, because we literally teach people. I mean, in journalism school, we teach people to use emotion. I mean, storytelling is always manipulative to some extent. We talk about storytelling in journalism. When we talk about, why people should get vaccines, we tell people to use the same tools essentially that anti-vaxxers are using, just use it evidence-based, right? Tell the story of somebody who didn't get the vaccine and died. Anyway, but my point is, as a journalist, I'm way more worried about trust. And what strikes me, I'm here at MIT for a year to study exactly all of these interventions, and almost all of these interventions seem to be about creating more mistrust. Ideally, a little bit more mistrust in wrong information than in right information, but essentially you're destroying trust or making people more skeptical. And of course, what we really need is to flip the paradigm a little bit, right? And we need to create trust where it belongs in a way. And I'm curious whether there is anything in your research when you look at these questions that suggests a way of doing that as well, or do we just chip away at it, hoping that we chip away more on the side where we don't want it?
I agree. Go ahead, Sander. Do you have a response to that?
Yeah. I think first it's really important to distinguish trust from skepticism towards specific headlines. You know, we run studies on evidence communication with journalists all the time. One of the problems in journalism is the not communicating uncertainty about facts, which leads people to distrust sources because they're perceived as not being honest. We did a huge experiment with the BBC where we exposed everyone on the BBC websites to the same headline with and without a confidence interval, for example. People will say that the facts are a little more uncertain because you're showing them uncertainty. They don't trust the BBC any less. And so this is the key thing for me, and this is what we recommend to the BBC. Be transparent, right? Be honest with people. They're not going to trust you less. And so it also didn't enhance trust, to be honest. But that's the key thing here. People can recognize, we shouldn't treat people as babies, right? They can recognize something that's emotionally manipulative or scapegoating, discount a headline, but not distrust the source or the institution, right? Studies also show that's not what's happening. So I'm not concerned about skepticism. And a lot of these interventions that say, oh, you know, making people skeptical, they say, oh, be warned about fake news as the intervention. I mean, that's not helping people, right? So at the core with all of these interventions, whether it's an accuracy nudge or media literacy tips or inoculation, at the end of the day, you're just helping people with tips and education, right? Are we really saying that educating people about some of these tricks and tips is backfiring and right, making people distrustful? By that token, we shouldn't be educating anybody, right? Educated citizens come out being a little more skeptical of things, and we generally think that that's a good thing. So I'm a bit concerned that there's a bit of a moral panic that, you know, helping people identify common tricks is somehow a bad thing for society. I tend to think it's the opposite and a way to gain trust rather than to lose it.
In a certain sense, I agree. It's just that it has to be done in such a way that you are mindful of that as a potential outcome. So like in the case that I showed you, we have the inoculation from the study that millions of people have seen by now, and it decreased belief in true things. That I think a lot of people would think is a problem. And so that's just an externality that we have to consider. I'm going to get to your question. I feel bad
we
for the
have
guy.
exactly 2 minutes, so
Okay.
very quick question, very quick answers from our speakers.
It's got to be a quick question.
Thank you. So one notable changes in recent years is the cost of producing fake news using language model and all that has become so low that it can saturate the system rather easily. How's that going to affect the traditional, like the way all these things might work or not?
So I guess one thing I'd say just briefly to that is a world where people are saying way more false stuff, then I'll give Sandra a ring up on the horn and be like, hey, guess what? Now that is in your favor, and so we're good to go. But I hope we don't get there though, frankly. So not that I don't want to call Sandra on the phone. I'm just saying I don't even see it false. But is there another? Is that it? Or Sandra, do you want to say final remarks?
We can take a final question.
Something interesting.
Oh, so no, I was just going to say, you know, inoculating against
with 1 minute to
deepfakes.
go. Yeah, do you have any conclusion?
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I'll just say inoculating against deepfakes, that's a real challenge because finding the techniques and explaining them to people, this is really difficult. So we're trying to work on inoculating against deepfakes, but it's tricky. The other thing I would say, and that's the last thing for me, is I agree that in the vaccine analogy, we should be monitoring side effects, right? Any intervention, right? Any medicine has side effects. We weigh the risks and benefits of taking medicine. So there's risk and benefits to any intervention. And we should research both the benefits and the potential harms and make informed decisions about how we trade them off.
I agree entirely.
Okay, thank you so much. Massive thank you to both speakers. Very thought-provoking talk. And yeah, we'll see everyone next time.
Thanks, Sandra.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.